In a quiet village nestled in a valley surrounded by ancient forests, there was a place no one dared to set foot in. A decrepit old house perched atop a lonely hill. The villagers called it the House of Shadows, and the story of its dark past haunted generations. They whispered that on moonless nights, an eerie blue light flickered through the shattered windows of the house. Sometimes chilling laughter echoed in the darkness, sounding like the final, strangled breaths of someone near death. Those brave or foolish enough to approach the house reported hearing footsteps following them, though the path was empty. The villagers believed the house was cursed after the mysterious disappearance of the family who once lived there. Decades ago, one horrific night left no survivors. All 6 members of the family vanished without a trace. When the villagers investigated the next day, all they found were dark, dried bloodstains smeared across the floor and cryptic symbols carved into the walls with what appeared to be fingernails. No one spoke of the house anymore, but it stood defiant, a grim silhouette against the sky, like a ghost waiting for the next unwitting soul to disturb its slumber. But Linh, a young and curious woman with a passion for discovery, was unlike the other villagers. She had heard the rumors, but instead of fear, she felt a strange thrill. To her, the house wasn't just a place of horror, but also the perfect inspiration for the novel she was writing. Ghost stories are just the product of human imagination, Linh told herself as she gazed at the house from a distance, its outline resembling a monstrous creature shrouded in mist. If I don't step inside, how will I uncover the truth? On a moonless night, when the village homes were locked tight and the windows shuttered against the dark, Linh grabbed her small flashlight and notebook. Without a word, she set off toward the hill, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The hill was steeper than Linh expected, its winding path lined with jagged rocks and tangled roots that seemed eager to trip her up. The flashlight beam cut through the heavy mist, revealing only a few steps ahead at a time. Behind her, the village lights were already a distant memory, swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the forest. Linh tightened her grip on the flashlight. Each crunch of leaves beneath her boots echoed unnaturally loud, as if the forest were amplifying her every step. The deeper she ventured, the more the air seemed to thicken, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, just the soft rustle of leaves in the underbrush. Linh paused, her heart thudding, and swung the flashlight toward the noise. The beam revealed nothing but the gnarled roots of a tree. She exhaled, trying to shake the unease clawing at her chest. But then it came again, closer this time, a distinct rustling like something dragging itself across the ground. "Who's there?" Linh called, her voice trembling slightly. Silence. She turned back toward the path and quickened her pace, but the sound followed. Faster, louder. It was as if someone or something was matching her steps just out of sight. Suddenly, she felt a hand brush her shoulder. Linh whipped around, flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught nothing but swirling mist. "Get a grip, Linh," she muttered under her breath, forcing her legs to keep moving. She was almost there. The silhouette of the house was looming closer through the fog, its crumbling walls and sagging roofline taking shape like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast. When she finally reached the clearing at the top of the hill, the oppressive silence was broken only by the creak of old wood as the wind pushed against the house's shutters. The sight of it made her stomach twist. The house looked worse up close. Its walls were darkened with moss and grime, and the broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. A rotting wooden door hung ajar, swaying gently on rusted hinges. Linh felt as if the house were watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. "Just a story," she whispered to herself, stepping onto the porch. The boards groaned under her weight, threatening to collapse with each step. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. A deep chill swept through her, not from the wind, but from something colder, older. Linh took a deep breath and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan that echoed through the house like a scream. She shone her flashlight inside, and the beam illuminated a desolate scene. The air was heavy with the stench of mildew and rot. Dust motes danced in the light, stirred by the draft that seeped through cracks in the walls. Inside, the house seemed frozen in time. A broken table sat in the center of what must have once been a living room, its surface littered with shattered glass and an overturned candlestick. Tattered curtains hung limply by the windows, and an old armchair lay on its side, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. Lynn stepped inside, her boots kicking up clouds of dust. She could hear her own breathing, sharp and shallow as she scanned the room. Something glinted on the floor near the far corner. She crouched down, picking up what looked like a rusted key. Its surface was etched with strange markings that she couldn't decipher, but she pocketed it anyway, figuring it might come in handy. The air seemed to shift around her, growing colder. Lynn's breath misted in the flashlight beam, and a faint sound reached her ears, so soft she thought she might have imagined it. A whisper. She turned sharply, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. There was no one there, but the sound came again, clearer this time. Leave. The word sent a shiver racing down her spine. It was faint and hollow, like a voice carried from the depths of a cave. Lynn forced herself to stand. "I'm not leaving," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "Not until I find out the truth." As if in response, the door behind her slammed shut. Lynn froze as the door behind her slammed shut, the groan of its hinges echoing in the eerie silence. Her flashlight beam wavered, catching glimpses of broken furniture and strange symbols carved into the walls. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like wind brushing through leaves, but growing louder. They seemed to flow from every corner, murmuring in an indecipherable language. "Hello?" Lynn called, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. Turning toward the staircase, Lynn hesitated. The air grew colder as she climbed, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out, the walls peeling and warped. At the end, one door stood ajar, faint light flickering within. She paused outside the first door on her left, its surface clawed and splintered. Something about it felt wrong. Lynn's hand trembled as she turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was sparse, the walls scrawled with jagged writing, "They watch." Her flashlight fell on a cracked mirror. For a moment, she saw only a reflection until a shadowy figure appeared behind her. Lynn spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Heart racing, she backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. At the end of the hallway, the open door seemed to beckon her. Inside, she found a chair surrounded by melted candle stubs. On the chair lay a journal, its cover stained dark. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching as she read, "Leave now. The house belongs to them. If you stay, you'll never leave." A sudden crash from downstairs made her jump. Heavy footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, ascending the stairs. Lynn clutched the journal, backing into the room and slamming the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. A single knock broke the silence. Lynn pressed her back against the door, trembling as the knocking grew louder. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, and a deep, guttural voice whispered, "Leave." Before she could react, the door burst open, throwing her to the ground. Her flashlight rolled away, leaving her in near darkness. She looked up and froze. A towering shadow stood in the doorway, its form shifting like smoke, with two glowing eyes piercing through her. "Stay away!" She screamed, scrambling backward. The whispers grew louder, frantic and urgent. In desperation, Lynn grabbed the journal and hurled it at the shadow. The instant the journal struck, a blinding flash of light erupted, and the figure let out a low growl before dissolving into the air. For a moment, silence fell. Lynn gasped for breath, but the house groaned ominously. The candles on the floor flared to life, burning an unnatural blue, while the symbols on the walls glowed and pulsed. She glanced at the journal lying open on the floor. A single line had appeared on the blank pages. "You cannot escape." The ground beneath her began to crack and split. Lynn grabbed the flashlight and bolted out of the room, her footsteps echoing as the sound of heavy, chasing footsteps filled the hallway. She reached the staircase and froze. The stairs had vanished, replaced by a gaping void. Spinning around, Lynn saw the shadow closing in. Desperate, she turned to the window at the end of the hallway, smashing the glass with her flashlight. Cold air rushed in as shards rained to the floor. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the ledge and jumped into the darkness. She tumbled down the hill, branches tearing at her as she rolled. When she finally came to a stop, she lay there, battered and gasping, the cold earth beneath her. The house stood silent above her, its windows dark, but Lin could feel its presence. As she stumbled away, she looked back and caught a glimpse of two faint, glowing eyes watching her from the broken window. She turned and ran, the whispers fading into the wind. But she knew they would never truly leave her. Lin staggered back to the village, her body bruised and her mind racing. The forest loomed behind her, dark and foreboding. The villagers' houses came into view, their warm lights promising safety, but the sense of unease clung to her like a second skin. When she finally reached her grandmother's house, she slammed the door behind her and collapsed onto the floor. Her grandmother rushed to her side, her face pale with worry. "Lin, what happened? Where have you been?" "I went to the house on the hill," Lin whispered, her voice hoarse. I shouldn't have. There's something there. Something alive." Her grandmother's face turned ashen. She gripped Lin's arm tightly. "You didn't bring anything back, did you?" Lin hesitated, the memory of the journal flashing through her mind. "No, nothing." Her grandmother's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. She helped Lin to her feet and guided her to bed, urging her to rest. But Lin couldn't sleep. The events of the night replayed in her mind, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glowing eyes of the shadow. Worse, she felt an inexplicable heaviness in her chest, as if the house's curse had followed her. The whispers began again, faint and distant, growing louder as the night wore on. Lin sat up, her heart pounding. She looked around the darkened room, clutching her blanket tightly. Then she felt it, a searing pain on her left shoulder. She cried out, pulling her sleeve down to see what was wrong. Her skin burned, and as she looked in the mirror, her stomach turned. A symbol, glowing faintly, had appeared on her shoulder. It was the same intricate design she had seen on the walls of the house. "No, no, no, no," she gasped, stumbling backward. Her grandmother burst into the room. "What is it?" Lin turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "It marked me. The house marked me." Her grandmother's expression turned grim. She sat Lin down and began lighting incense, muttering prayers under her breath. "The house is cursed," she said. "It does not let go of those it claims. You should have never gone there, Lin." "What does it want from me?" Lin whispered, trembling. "To keep you," her grandmother said gravely. "The house does not just haunt, it consumes." The whispers grew louder, almost drowning out her grandmother's voice. The air in the room turned icy, and the flickering candlelight dimmed. Lin clutched her head, the voices piercing her mind. "Grandmother, make it stop!" she cried. Her grandmother stood and began sprinkling water around the room, chanting louder. The whispers receded slightly, but they didn't disappear entirely. The glowing symbol on Lin's shoulder faded, but the pain lingered. "Is it gone?" Lin asked, her voice trembling. "For now," her grandmother said, "but it will come back. The house has latched onto you. You must break the connection before it's too late." "How?" Her grandmother hesitated. "You must return to the house and destroy whatever binds it to this world. But be warned, child, it will not let you leave a second time." Lin's blood ran cold. The thought of going back to that cursed place made her stomach churn, but she knew her grandmother was right. The house wouldn't stop until it had her. Clenching her fists, Lin nodded. "I'll do it." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Lin prepared herself. Armed with her flashlight, a small bottle of holy water, and her grandmother's prayers, she set off toward the hill once more. The house stood waiting, its dark silhouette looming against the pale morning sky. This time it felt alive, as if it had been anticipating her return. Lin took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind her. Lin stepped into the house, the stale air wrapping around her like a shroud. The door slammed shut behind her, but this time, she didn't flinch. Her flashlight flickered as if the darkness were trying to swallow the light. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder and more insistent. They no longer sounded like distant voices, but a chorus of entities all around her, their words overlapping in an incomprehensible cacophony. Clutching the bottle of holy water and her grandmother's prayer beads, Lin forced herself forward. The staircase loomed ahead, but it seemed longer now, stretching into a shadowy void. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the house were trying to push her back. At the top of the stairs, the hallway had changed. The walls were alive with writhing symbols, glowing and pulsating like living veins. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had been slightly ajar during her last visit, now stood wide open, a cold blue light spilling out. Lin approached cautiously, her every step echoing in the unnatural silence. As she crossed the threshold, the air shifted and the room seemed to expand. The chair was still in the center, but now it was surrounded by a perfect circle of glowing runes. Floating above it was the journal, its pages flipping wildly as though caught in a storm. The shadows gathered in the corners of the room, their forms shifting and coalescing. Lynn's flashlight flickered, its beam weak against the oppressive darkness. She could feel the presence of something massive and malevolent, watching her with cold detachment. "This is your end," a guttural voice growled, echoing from every direction. Lynn's grip tightened on the holy water. "No, I'm taking my life back." The shadows lunged toward her, but Lynn flung the holy water into the air, the droplets glowing as they landed on the runes. A high-pitched screech filled the room as the symbols hissed and dimmed. The journal fell to the ground, its pages burning as if touched by an unseen fire. The house shook violently, the walls splitting open to reveal endless darkness. Lynn dropped to her knees, clutching the prayer beads as she recited her grandmother's chant. The shadows recoiled, but the guttural voice laughed. "You think you can defy me? You are already mine." The symbol on Lynn's shoulder burned fiercely, its light pulsing in sync with the runes on the floor. She screamed in pain, but forced herself to continue chanting, the words spilling from her lips even as her voice cracked. The journal ignited completely, and the room was consumed by a blinding light. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The house groaned, its foundations trembling as if the very essence of its curse was unraveling. With one final surge of energy, the light exploded outward, and Lynn was thrown back against the wall. When she opened her eyes, the house was silent. The symbols were gone, the walls bare and crumbling. The oppressive air had lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Lynn staggered to her feet, her shoulder aching. She looked down and saw that the mark was gone, leaving only a faint scar. She stepped out of the house into the pale morning light. Behind her, the structure groaned one last time before collapsing in on itself, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. Lynn stood there for a long moment, the village in the distance. She had survived, but the weight of what she had faced would never truly leave her. As she turned to walk back, she swore she heard a faint whisper in the wind. Until next time. Weeks after destroying the house, Lynn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows felt darker, and whispers haunted her nights. One evening by the river, the whispers returned, growing louder until a black, icy hand emerged from the water, grabbing her ankle. Lynn screamed and managed to break free, but in the water's reflection, she saw a twisted version of herself smirking with glowing eyes. "You thought you could escape," it said, its voice blending hers with the guttural tones of the shadow. The house was only a doorway. Terrified, Lynn ran to her grandmother, who listened with a grim expression. "The curse isn't gone," her grandmother said. "The shadow has anchored itself to you. Its source lies buried where the house once stood." That night, under a full moon, Lynn and her grandmother returned to the ruins. The air was heavy, and as they chanted and sprinkled salt, the earth beneath the rubble shifted. A dark mist seeped from the ground, revealing a hidden trapdoor. Her grandmother opened it, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. "The source is below. You must face it, Lynn. Only you." Lynn descended alone, the whispers growing louder. At the bottom, she found a cavern bathed in blue light. In the center was an altar holding a black, pulsating heart wrapped in shadow. The towering figure of the shadow appeared behind it. "You belong to me," it growled. Summoning her courage, Lynn smashed her grandmother's protective charm onto the altar. The black heart erupted in flames, and the shadow screamed as it unraveled, consumed by the fire. The cavern shook violently, and Lynn fell to her knees. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the hill. The ruins were quiet, and her grandmother stood beside her, smiling with relief. "It's over," her grandmother said. But as Lynn turned to leave, she glanced back at the ruins. For a fleeting moment, she saw a faint flicker of light and heard the faint echo of distant laughter. Days passed, and Lynn tried to convince herself the nightmare was over. The village returned to its usual quiet, and Lynn focused on helping her grandmother with daily chores. But the sense of unease lingered. One night, Ling awoke abruptly. Her room was pitch black, the air heavy and still. At first, she thought it was a bad dream, but then she noticed the faint glow of a symbol on her ceiling. It was the same intricate design that had burned into her shoulder before. "No," Lin whispered, backing away. "It's gone. I destroyed it." The glow grew stronger, and the whispers returned, soft, almost mocking. Suddenly, the symbol burst into a blinding light, and Lin's surroundings melted away. She was no longer in her room, but standing on the hill where the house once stood. Before her, the ruins were gone. The house had reappeared, its facade even darker and more menacing than before. The windows glowed faintly with a sickly green light, and the front door creaked open as if inviting her inside. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed from the doorway. "You only delayed me, Lin. Now the door is wide open." Lin clutched her grandmother's charm, realizing the shadow hadn't been destroyed. It had been waiting for her to weaken. She turned to run, but the ground beneath her cracked, and black tendrils shot out, wrapping around her legs. They dragged her toward the house, the door growing larger and larger until it swallowed her whole. Inside, she found herself in a warped version of the house. The hallways twisted and stretched, the walls alive with pulsating veins of shadow. The whispers were deafening now, repeating her name over and over. "Show yourself," Lin shouted, her voice trembling. The shadow materialized, larger than ever, its glowing eyes fixed on her. "You open the door, Lin. The curse is no longer bound to the house. It's everywhere now, in the village, in you." Lin's heart raced. "Why me? Why won't you leave me alone?" The shadow laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You freed me, and now, you will be the vessel that spreads me further." As it spoke, the tendrils of darkness wrapped tighter around her, pulling her toward its towering form. Lin struggled, her mind racing. She remembered her grandmother's words, "The curse can only be severed at its source." But she had already destroyed the heart. What more could she do? Summoning her courage, Lin grabbed the charm from her neck and held it up. "You won't take me," she screamed, slamming the charm into the ground. The house trembled, its walls splitting apart. The shadow roared as cracks of light pierced through its form, shattering the oppressive darkness. Lin closed her eyes, focusing all her energy on her grandmother's chants, repeating them with all her strength. The shadow's form dissolved into smoke, and the house began to collapse around her. Lin ran, her legs burning as she sprinted through the crumbling halls. She dove through the front door just as the house imploded, collapsing into itself with a deafening roar. When Lin opened her eyes, she was back in her room, the ceiling blank, the air calm. She clutched the charm tightly, her body trembling. But as she sat there, trying to catch her breath, she noticed a faint mark on her palm. The same symbol as before, faint but unmistakable. The whispers were gone, but Lin couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow wasn't truly defeated. It was waiting, patient and silent, for another chance. And this time, it wouldn't wait long. Despite the shadow's apparent defeat, Lin's life remained uneasy. The mark on her palm still haunted her, and strange sensations of being watched persisted. One night, while preparing offerings at the village shrine, Lin felt a shift in the air. The usually peaceful shrine was silent. The offerings decayed unnaturally. Her grandmother noticed too. "The spirit's influence is spreading," she said. Suddenly, the earth trembled, and a crack appeared beneath the shrine. Black mist began to rise, taking the form of the shadow. "You thought you could hide," it hissed. "The door is still open." Her grandmother stepped forward with a protective scroll, chanting fiercely, "You will not take her." But the shadow laughed, expanding into the shrine, its dark tendrils shattering the charms. "It is not just her I seek. The whole village will fall." "Run, Lin," her grandmother urged, pushing her away. Reluctantly, Lin fled back to the house. She barricaded herself in, knowing the shadow was spreading, its power growing. Desperate, she turned to an old book her grandmother kept, discovering a ritual that could sever the curse. It spoke of confronting the shadow at its source, the land itself, cursed long before the house was built. Lin knew what she had to do. The next morning, Lin stood before the hill where the house had once stood. A dark hole in the ground had replaced the ruins, and mist poured from it. The shadow emerged, more powerful than ever. "You came back," it said, its voice mocking. Lin opened the ritual book, chanting the first words of the incantation. The shadow roared, lashing out, but Lin stood firm. She threw holy water into the pit, and the earth shook violently. The shadow shrieked, but Lin continued the chant. The hole began to glow, and the shadow writhed, its form breaking apart as light consumed it. With a final scream, the shadow dissolved into nothingness. Lin returned to the village, weary but triumphant. Her grandmother embraced her, but Lin could sense the lingering darkness beneath the surface. Though the shadow was gone for now, Lin knew it could return, and when it did, she would be ready. Weeks after the shadow's defeat, Lin thought peace had returned. The village resumed its routine and the whispers faded, but Lin still felt uneasy. The mark on her palm remained, and sometimes she sensed an unseen presence, a cold weight lurking in the air. One afternoon, Lin and her grandmother noticed strange markings at their shrine, dark, oily fingerprints on the stones and a cracked charm. "The curse is not gone," her grandmother whispered. "Something is watching." That night, Lin couldn't shake the eerie feeling. She heard scratching noises from the walls and felt a chill settle in the room. Then the door creaked open, even though it was locked. A cold wind rushed in and shadows deepened, almost as if they were waiting for her. Steeling herself, Lin stepped outside. A twisted silhouette emerged from the darkness, flickering like an unfinished nightmare. "You can't stop me," it whispered. "I am beyond this world. I have always been here." Lin, determined, recited the incantation from the ritual book. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as she chanted. But as it vanished, Lin noticed a faint glowing mark on the ground, the symbol of the curse. It wasn't over. The shadow had merely retreated, leaving a mark on the land. Desperate for answers, Lin sought out the village elder, who revealed the shadow's true nature. It was tied to the very land, older than the house or even the village itself. To defeat it, you must find the heart of the land, she explained, handing Ling a worn map. But the shadow will fight back. The land will try to deceive you. Lin set off alone into the forest, guided by the map. The trees grew thicker, the air heavier with each step, until she stumbled upon an ancient stone circle, covered in strange markings. In the center was a dark pool, its surface empty, reflecting nothing. The shadows swirled around her, and she knew she had found the heart of the land. But then, she heard a whisper, the same voice she had heard from the shadow. "Lin." The wind howled, and a familiar laugh echoed through the trees. The shadow was here, in the very heart of the land, and this time it would not be so easily defeated. Lin stood frozen, her heart pounding as the whisper echoed through the stone circle. The shadows closed in around her, thickening and twisting like tendrils reaching out to claim her. The dark pool in the center of the circle shimmered with an unnatural glow, reflecting nothing but the emptiness of the world. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed again, as the ground trembled beneath Lin's feet. The air grew heavier, the pressure in her chest mounting. She knew the shadow was no longer a mere force to be defeated. It was part of the land itself, bound to it for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And now, that moment had come. Lin's fingers tightened around her grandmother's charm, the only thing that had protected her in the past. But she knew the charm alone would not be enough this time. The shadow had grown stronger, more connected to the earth than ever before. She had to sever its bond to the land. Summoning every ounce of strength, Lin recalled the ritual her grandmother had spoken of, the one that could destroy the shadow's source. She began to chant, her voice trembling but steady, as she spoke the ancient words from the book. The shadows recoiled, their form flickering, but they quickly surged back with greater force, lashing at her with a growl of fury. The pool at the center of the stone circle began to ripple, its dark surface swirling violently. From it, a shape began to emerge, an enormous, monstrous form, more terrifying than anything Lin had ever seen. It was the shadow in its true, terrifying form, an ancient being of darkness, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. "You think you can defeat me?" The shadow boomed, its voice like thunder. "I am eternal. I am the land itself. You are nothing." Lin's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She continued chanting, her voice growing stronger with each word. The air around her vibrated with energy, and the ground beneath her cracked open, revealing the raw, pulsing power that had been buried there for centuries. The shadow screeched in anger as the light from Lin's chant grew brighter. The earth trembled violently, and the dark pool began to swirl faster. Lin could feel the power of the land, the curse itself, rising to stop her, but she refused to back down. she knew what had to be done. With one final cry, Lin plunged the charm into the heart of the pool. A brilliant light erupted, blinding her as the shadow writhed and screamed in agony. The light grew, engulfing the entire stone circle until the shadow's monstrous form began to disintegrate, its dark essence unraveling. The air around Lin crackled with the intensity of the energy being released. She held her ground, her voice unwavering, until the last remnants of the shadow dissolved into nothingness. Silence fell. When the light faded, Lin collapsed to her knees, exhausted. The forest was still. The stone circle was now empty, the pool's surface calm and clear. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lin breathed deeply, feeling the land's energy return to its natural balance. She looked around, but the shadow was gone. There was no sign of its monstrous form, no trace of its dark influence. The curse had been severed at its source, and the land had been freed. Lin sat there for a long time, gathering her strength before finally standing up. She knew that this victory had not come without a price, but the curse had been broken, and the shadow's hold on the village had ended. As she made her way back to the village, Lin felt a strange sense of peace. The path she had taken had been long and filled with darkness, but now the light had returned. The village, once again, was safe. However, Lin knew that the shadow's power was not easily forgotten, and though the land had been cleansed for now, she could never forget the lessons learned in the heart of the darkness. The balance between light and shadow would always remain delicate, and the land would need constant care to ensure that the shadow never returned. But for now, Lin could rest. The curse had been defeated, the land had been freed, and the village was safe once more. And though the shadow might one day rise again, Lin knew that she would be ready to face it, no matter what the future held.